Thank you very much, and good evening. I'm going to talk in this introduction really mostly about the work in the next room, and which may bring up some of the kind of meatier questions that maybe we'll get into in the discussion afterwards. This project's called Five Eyes, and it was the result of spending, in fact, I realized almost a year hanging around the V&A in various ways, meeting lots of people involved in kind of all areas of the museum, from kind of the people who select objects, to the archivists, to the people who work on preservation of objects, who work on simply, not simply at all, but building mounts for objects. Every stage of kind of care for objects and thinking about objects, which is what the museum kind of revolves around very much. It started in particular from thinking about the museum's original role and how that role's changed and what that role now is. The museum was founded by Henry Cole as very much kind of pedagogical institute. It was meant to teach the British public about what constituted good design, essentially. And there was sort of two parallel aims to that. I mean, or really one real aim, which was to get them to buy more nice stuff. But also, primarily, that would also encourage British manufacturing to improve, to provide them with the nice stuff. So there was an education of the public and an education of industry bound up into this, along with kind of Cole's particular theories of aesthetics. And so I was wondering kind of what does that role in design in particular look like now? If we're trying to educate people to appreciate design better, and if we're trying to educate or kind of inform or persuade manufacturers to be involved in different forms of design and manufacture, what is it that we might hope to persuade them to do? Perhaps a forlorn hope, but at least we might start by sort of talking this problem through. And for me, there's a very clear imperative there, which is increasingly not to talk about the surface appearance of things, and not to talk purely in terms of surface aesthetics, but to talk about how things work in the world. This is a furrow I've been ploughing for quite some time, not least because I've been generally fascinated with the internet and in all its many forms, and particularly with our seeming inability to really grasp what it is as something that kind of involves us and we're involved in every day of our lives, that shares space with us, that is no longer a kind of remote other entity, but is something that surrounds us, that we work through, that we play through, that we communicate through, that binds us together and performs kind of many functions in our lives. And yet, most people don't really seem to know what it is. There's kind of many, what I consider to be incredibly dangerous metaphors for it, like the cloud, as though it's some sort of magical faraway place, rather than something that does impact us all the time. And so, for a long time, I felt I was sort of trying to come up with basically better metaphors for the internet. But after thinking that through for quite a long time and understand, trying to come up with a better name for the internet itself, you kind of start to realize that that's not really the problem. The problem is trying to define deeper structures that underlie that. The fact that all of these technologies have their own kind of embedded dispositions and motives. When you talk about design, you're essentially talking about what's gone into that design, what's formed the shape of that design. And what appears to be at first one invisible system, the internet, is really in common with all of our sort of grand macroeconomic or political invisible systems, things that seem to us kind of deeply complex and far away, but are quite difficult for us to grasp. So this is the kind of things that I think a museum now, particularly one of design, might be trying to address. How you understand not the surface of things, but the networks that underlie them, and how they function, how they came to be. Essentially a kind of literacy in complex systems. And you could look at the V&A, at least as I do, as you might be able to tell, as one of those kind of insanely complex systems. I mean, the first question when confronted with the V&A is where did all this stuff come from? Who chose these particular objects to represent, the particular stories that are being told? Who chose which stories to tell? How did all these things kind of get gathered together? And the more you look into that, the more you understand the kind of different pressures that have faced the collection and the institution over time, kind of political pressures and social pressures. You can see, looking through the history of the museum, when different periods have forced different kind of attitudes on collections within the museum, different ideas about what stories should be told, different ideas and values and how those kind of ideas and values of design and aesthetics have changed. And behind the visible surface of the museum, of course, is this incredibly deep and complex system that generates all of this. I became obsessed with this in the form of the archive, as well as the V&A building here and other sites on loan, stuff like this. There's also Blythe House, which you may or may not know about, which is the V&A's repository out in West Kensington, which is an extraordinary place filled with a huge percentage of the collection which isn't on show, and also the records of that collection, which is where I get really interested. These are a few examples, and you can see many more next door, of the archive files of the collection, the information about the collection itself. These are called nominal files. They contain the history and the provenance of all the objects. It's a kind of shadow museum of data that underlies the objects themselves. In particular, inside these files, you'll find all of the letters from curators to the original owners of the objects, who've offered to loan them or requesting to buy them, the correspondence that went into that arrangement, the history of the acquisition of the object, and the provenance of the object, where it was found, where it came from. They include kind of everything, including bills of sale and handwritten histories of things. Provenance, in particular, seems to be the thing that embedded in these files. Like, where did this stuff in particular come from? Which I find to be incredibly fascinating. And like all kind of complex systems, it's quite untidy and incredibly rich at the same time. And there's other mirrors to those forms of data as well. What's amazing about the nominal files in particular is that they're still being generated, right? Objects today, still collected, they'll print out every email from all the curators and put them into those files because good archivists still don't really trust electricity yet. It's not proven. But there are large volumes of digital data as well. Huge amount of that has been digitized and is available as well in kind of huge databases. And this is the material in particular that I was working with. Fascinated by the qualities of data as a material in itself, something that you can find the edges of, that shape, you can manipulate, and through it you can understand as well, again, how it came together. And I decided to treat it, in effect, as intercepted data, as surveillance data almost, as metadata, as security agencies might treat our data. And I've worked slightly like this in the past. This is a previous project called A Quiet Disposition, which is based on the concept of the disposition matrix, which is a large database about which very little is known, which basically governs the American drone war. So it's a database of names and places and connections between people, which is constantly gathering vast amounts of information into it, the ultimate outcome of which is very concrete. People get killed. This database decides who dies. I set up a kind of dark mirror to it, or I hope, in fact, I should say a lighter mirror to it, in the fact that mine doesn't kill people, which scours the open internet constantly for information about drones in various forms and performs the same analysis on them, drawing out names and places, locations, and drawing these kind of networks of connections between people. What I'm essentially doing here is showing the way in which data implicates. As soon as you start to cast the net this wide, you start to draw all of these stories in together, seen through very particular ways. But I'm also quite nervous about particularly some of the ethical problems of doing work around this, the point of kind of reproducing surveillance in many ways. This is the balloon project from last summer, which Corinna mentioned, down in South London, when I flew this aerostat over South London. And I did a number of things with it. One of the first things I did was put a camera on it. And the intention of that was to give everyone access to this aerial perspective, which is, historically and still usually the prerogative of certain forms of power. But I got really, really uncomfortable doing it really, really quickly, because essentially what I felt that I was doing more surveillance, right? I was just simply continuing that worldview, and I stopped doing the camera stuff and looked at other approaches. I felt like it's very difficult to make art about surveillance without doing more surveillance, and therefore basically just kind of accustoming people to it, which isn't a very helpful thing to do. But then with the collections data, this felt like a body of data that I had less of those issues with. It wasn't so directly about people, but about things. So I built a system that allowed me to explore this system, explore it through the data in the way that surveillance data essentially is managed, by building these relationships between things. I built a system which you can also use, which is now entirely online, for navigating the collection through unexpected connections. So each object's description and text were analyzed. And this is where the first kind of part of that political decision-making about systems comes in, because they've forced it through a system designed for news tagging, and a system run by Thomson Reuters, a large newspaper organization, news organization, that can extract semantic information from text and build it into, extract kind of terms of meaning, which you see over on the right, names, places, dates, this kind of thing. But already you get into kind of these deep levels of bias. That system itself has been trained on newspaper articles. It's trained to look for the kind of things it expects to find in current affairs, not necessarily in toys or in kind of 18th century ceramics. I discovered, in fact, this system has an incredible bias in the collection towards thinking that everything's dodgy, and particularly related to surveillance, because every time it came across the term signature, which you do a lot in a museum, it thought this referred to electronic signatures and therefore to some kind of cyber surveillance or cryptography. So already there were these deep misunderstandings kind of built into the system. But what I was doing was looking for interesting, strange, and odd connections to build my collections. And this is exactly how surveillance systems operate. This is actually a pair of slides released today or yesterday by The Intercept, one of the kind of huge cache of Snowden files, showing the NSA doing precisely this operation on captured SIM phone data. So it's looking at huge tranches of data pulled from Pakistani cell phone records in order to identify couriers for bin Laden in this case. What had happened, as is revealed in the slides, is that the number one likely courier that they pulled out was in fact an Al Jazeera journalist, because to a technological system, a terrorist and a journalist perform relatively the same functions when all you see is their patterns of travel and their cell phone use. They're trying to do the same things with regards to technology, so therefore they appear to be the same. But I built these stacks, and this is a network of about 60 objects which formed the basis for the very first of those cabinets. And each of these cabinets tells an individual story, or rather a small network of stories, each of them based on what's called the 5 Eyes that you'll see referenced here, FVEY, the 5 Eyes being the 5 Anglophone intelligence agencies that share data, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, UK, and US. So this is the Australia cabinet, which starts from a story about the Australian government's, and particularly its intelligence agencies' involvement in their current immigration program. So this ended up referring, through giving these stories to the system to find objects connected loosely to it, to stories of migration and stories of distance through a pair of Indian boomerangs, an Australian icon that in fact originated far away, a Papua New Guinean endangered bird, and a nutcracker that comes from an ocean liner, one of the main ships of the Oriana line, which took many, many migrants to Australia over the years. Each of these cabinets with these objects is then presented on top of their stacks of metadata themselves. So from those networks of objects, I'd select a few which had these particularly impressive stories, but they'd be connected through these stacks to their metadata, right? To see kind of deep into the stacks of networks of history that lie behind all of them. Each of the individual objects as well are kind of amazing chance encounters with the objects within the collection. So even while doing something quite this kind of dark and slightly disturbing occasionally, that you still stumble upon quite kind of extraordinary tiny stories, and doubt as well. The little wooden lion in there, which there's at least 3 stories about within the collection. No one's quite sure where he came from. More like this one, we can be slightly more sure of its origin. These are a pair of bracelets that belong to the wife of the Emperor Tewodros, who was killed in a British punitive expedition to Abyssinia. We brought these back as loot. They've been part of the kind of museum's collection ever since, and the museum was understandably unsure about putting these objects on display because of all the issues that surround kind of provenance and the right of return of museum objects that affect kind of all museums now. It was interesting that when I was asked why this object would go on display, the answer is, first and foremost, because the system has selected it, as though, of course, the system itself has no political biases, has no intentions kind of built into it. Those kind of, that back and forth is kind of exactly what underlies the entire process, this kind of perceived neutrality of technology, which allows political ends to kind of go somewhat unquestioned. So the whole thing is available online. And this is really, to me, the real work. The fact that they built a running software system of which the installation is kind of just one possible version, instantiation of, and one possible telling as well, because again, this system could be used to tell so many stories. That, again, is one of the kind of lessons for me of investigating these things and using the data as the material, is to always understand all the kind of many, many uses to which it can be put. So what I'm doing here, I hope, is to investigate what happens when you deal with information about stuff. What stuff it surfaces, the uses to which it can be put, which are many. And simply trying to get to grips myself by kind of playing out some of the strategies that I know are being played out at far kind of grander political levels, business, corporate levels all the time. And underneath that, there's a belief, a hope that by doing so we educate people about the nature of complex systems. I try not to be too didactic in the work, and actually while I put a hell of a lot of my own politics into this project, in terms of the stories that I choose to tell, I think the deeper lesson is more, I'm trying to work out, like I did with trying to work out better terms for the cloud. How do we come to better, more intuitive, more human understandings of complex systems so that we can apply that understanding more widely, back again to political and social and legal systems, which we haven't yet figured out very good ways of doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming. I was given 10 minutes, and I was thinking very hard what it is I should talk about in 10 minutes, given that I don't have an exhibit, nor a PowerPoint. So I think a good question to ask in this setting, in this country today might be, no, it's not about the election result, no. It's to what extent, almost 2 years after the Snowden revelations, which more or less is 2 years now, it's going to be so in a few weeks, have we learned the right lessons from that story? And since I have 10 minutes, I'll try to be very provocative, and my answer would be that I think we haven't learned the right lessons. The lessons we have learned are probably extremely misleading, and that the debate that has emerged in many activist communities in the last 2 years does not really inspire much optimism in me, and I don't think that I am exceptional in this regard. To give you a very brief expansion of this thesis, and I'll get to much more substantial stuff with some examples shortly, I would like to say that the current framing of the lessons we've learned from the Snowden revelations and debate is that what has been happening in America, Britain, and other countries implicated in the scandal has been an overreach of the surveillance state. The story that we hear is that it's a problem with the NSA and other related agencies in respect in other countries have become too greedy. They suck in too much data, they're completely uncontrolled, there is a lot of legalistic stuff that we can hardly understand that they are violating, and that the way out of this impasse, and I'm summarizing a lot of debates over the last 2 years here, but the way out of this impasse is for us to pass better laws and for us to design more secure encrypted technologies. And that's presented as a way out and is embraced as such by many activists, both in Europe and in America. I would argue that this conception and conceptualization of the problem doesn't account for some of the main factors which are responsible for the immense amount of data that's being generated, collected, stored, and traded. It's not just a matter of the surveillance state getting out of control. It's not just a story of some kind of institutional overreach and some kind of violation of legalistic and technological norms. Ultimately, it's a story about profound transformations in economic and political structures. It's ultimately a story about capitalism, and it's not a story just about the surveillance state bent on surveillance getting out of control. And this story, once told through the perspective and framework of transformations in contemporary capitalism, would probably prevent us from coming up with this somewhat easy, even if unimplementable solutions like tighter laws and regulations and more encryption technologies, because the kinds of changes we'll have to push for will be very different and will require much more effort and much better strategizing outside of the legal and technological bubbles, which are the two bubbles which define much of the conversation in the post-Norton era. And to help us crystallize what I have in mind, given that there is not much time for me to expand on the entire argument, I'll just mention a couple of examples. A few weeks ago, those of you who've been reading some of the technology news, you might have mentioned a very peculiar agreement that was struck between IBM and Apple on the one hand, and then the Post of Japan on the other. And those of you who know something about Japan would know that this is not an institution which just deals with mail. The post office there, it's a much more ambitious institutional entity which also deals with issues like insurance, health, and many others. It's a quasi-state within itself, and so it's, as far as I know, still a government-owned institution which is about to get privatized. And the deal struck between IBM and Apple on the one hand and the Post of Japan on the other involves basically Apple and IBM becoming the important, I don't want to say default, but important allies and important partners of the Post of Japan when it comes to caring for the aging populations, right? And this is going to happen because, well, iPads have the sensors in them, they can care for the elderly, they can monitor what's happening to them, they can also provide tips, they can perhaps, when things are very depressing, can provide some entertainment. I mean, the overall use of sensors in the context of caring for the elderly is not new, right? There are entire packages sold on the market for caring for the elderly with sensors being embedded in the carpet, so the moment you fall, the carpet can detect it and do something about it, right? So what Apple and IBM do in this particular instance is just a very tiny example representative of the broader transformation. But this, I would argue, is not an exception. Caring for the elderly is just one of the many initiatives that Silicon Valley will be eager to take upon simply because they run the infrastructure through which many of these problems can now be solved, right? So, and that again would happen thanks to the ability to monitor what is happening and intervene in the real time. It's not just the care for the elderly. I would argue that this would also apply to things like optimizing public transportation, optimizing our energy use, optimizing healthcare and health outside of the elderly. Again, all of you know about the buzz surrounding wearables. All of you know the buzz surrounding even the iPhone, which now has the sensors and the ability to constantly monitor your activity level and make certain interventions, or at least inform you of the things you should be doing. And this list can continue, right? And I would argue that to put it in very short and blunt terms, the offer that is made by Silicon Valley today is that it's going to be the new welfare state. It's going to run things for the general population that we would traditionally associate with non-market institutions that were socialized or operated at least on a somewhat different logic, whether it's care for the elderly, whether it's education, whether it's public transportation, whether it's health. That list, as I've said, can be very long, but the pitch that is now being made to citizens, but I would argue also to the governments, is that by monitoring virtually every single bit of our existence, we can solve problems in new ways, and we can actually solve problems at all, because it's not just that we can solve problems in new ways, it's just that the state no longer has the capacity, the resources, and the money to solve problems differently, right? So this speech from Silicon Valley comes at a very right moment from the perspective of the Silicon Valley, because the whole system can no longer cope with the expenses that are generated by the other excesses of the system. You have this country, you know this problem very well. You have more and more obese people. What do we do with them? NHS cannot pay for them. What do? Well, we try to make sure that we can actually control the people receiving some kind of benefits actually do the work. So we want to make sure that they exercise. How do we make sure that they exercise? Well, we try to rely on sensors, right? This ability to actually check and control individual behavior and thus optimize welfare packages associated with it can be very easily provided by Silicon Valley. And this is why I think we would not understand how hard and tough it would be to defeat Silicon Valley, which is all bent on gathering as much data as possible, if you do not ask very, you can say that this is a very deep question, you can say that this is a very vulgar kind of functionalist question, but the question we need to be asking is what kind of role Silicon Valley is playing in contemporary capitalism. And the role that it's playing in contemporary capitalism today, I would argue, has very much to do with the extremely sad state of other institutions that used to provide the goods that we traditionally expect from the welfare state. And this is where Silicon Valley at this point does present a certain ideological agenda and does present a certain ideological program in front of us. And I think this is, once you start putting things this way, you clearly see that it would be very hard for the system to function without continuous monitoring and gathering of data. Right? If you make perfectly encrypted technologies that no provider of services would be able to look at and insert advertising in them, you would not be able to have any of the services for free. I mean, right? This is the key component here, that the pitch that's being made by Silicon Valley doesn't just reach to the hipsters. If it only reached to the hipsters who can afford to pay through other means, it would be a very banal proposition. The proposition that is being made by Silicon Valley is that suddenly the services can actually be affordable by the poor as well. You already see how this argument played out with email 10 or 15 years ago. Suddenly, you can get the best email system in the world, and you don't have to pay for it because Constance Sarbanes pays for it by generating ads that you can later convert into dollars, and this is what pays for your use of the system. I would argue that this is the logic that will be paying for eventually the smart thermostats that we're going to have in our apartments, perhaps even the self-driving cars, but all other much less impressive parts of this system, whether it's sensors for health monitoring or something else, right? And this pitch aimed at the people who cannot afford the services otherwise, to me, presents a very formidable challenge, because it means that to defeat Silicon Valley, or the ideology that it represents, and clearly we are not just talking about Silicon Valley here, it's a much broader phenomenon, we actually need to go beyond the strictly technological and strictly legalistic ways of discussing these matters and try to ask questions that are much broader and actually have some kind of political economic dimension about the roles and services that these companies are providing. And then, of course, we will also be able to ask all sorts of other questions. Who owns this data? Why do you assume that this data automatically belongs to Google or Facebook? How can we build a system in which all of the data does not end up in just one data repository, which in this case would be Google? How can we perhaps take it out of the market realm altogether? Should it be a market commodity? All of those questions we cannot resolve just by building better encryption mechanisms and suing NSA and others in courts, which is a very important part of the job, but we have to be able to move this debate forward, right? And in the 2 years that have passed, I don't really think that this has happened, right? And it's very challenging, and because the news keep coming, and there are so many abuses that are being revealed about the cooperation and also about the way in which NSA and its partners abuse the law, that it's very tempting for us just to focus on that element. And I think we have to start asking other questions, right? Because otherwise, we would not be able to understand the political, social, and economic landscape of the next 5 or 10 years. And I would argue that at this point, you can clearly see that data is the means by which these companies are trying to roll out more and more services, but also more and more infrastructure, right? And I'll just finish with one example, and I think that will make things a bit clearer. It's not very well known in Western Europe and North America, but a company like Facebook, for example, has become one of the leading providers of internet infrastructure in the developing world through its Internet.org project. Right? And what does Internet.org do? Well, it partners with mobile operators in various countries, and it basically offers users to have free access to Facebook and a few other websites, while the rest of the internet they have to pay for, right? By app, so they have to pay by traffic. This creates an environment where more and more of activity is channeled to Facebook, right? So users basically can access many of the apps, whether they have to do with education or health or something else, but to do that, they'll have to join the Facebook empire, right? And they'll have to become a user, they'll have to submit the data, they have to make sure that their activity is being monitored, and so forth and so forth. And for me, the proposition that Facebook makes in this case is very clear. It's that we'll give you some kind of access to some kind of internet, because your government is never going to do that for you because they're broken, they have no money, and will go and do that development work for you. And for me, what does Facebook do in this case? Well, they're a development agency. How are they different from the World Bank doing the same or pitching to do the same in Africa or Latin America or elsewhere? Yet, we never analyze them with the same degree of scrutiny that we would apply even to the World Bank, right? And this is where I think the problem lies. We have a very hard time understanding the political and economic rationale according to which these companies operate. And we have to start seeing them beyond just the conventional labels of technology companies or digital companies or data companies, and start asking questions as to whether they will be the new providers, not just of infrastructure, but also of solutions to problems that we have previously tackled differently. We tackled them politically, we tackled them collectively, we tackled them economically. We didn't tackle them through the market. And even though Facebook and Google would claim that they're solving this problem through technology, very often they're not solving them through technology, they are solving them through the market. It's just that the market involves some kind of invisible exchange of data, so it's presented to us as Google providing a free service, but it's not a free service, it's essentially a claim that you are surrendering to Google to extract profit from your future life as they are incorporating all the data about you and finding ways to monetize it, which will be the case with the Internet.org project, because much of the data that they're now gathering in Africa or Latin America is of no value to advertisers. But it will be in 5 or 10 years. Right? So again, we have to start bringing very different perspectives to this issue, and some of those perspectives will have to go beyond just the regular set of questions that we situate and associate with the technology debate. They will have to be about economics, they will have to be about ownership, they'll have to be about power. We cannot just continue in this techno-legalistic babble, or bubble, or both. So I think I'll stop here, and perhaps we can discuss. Thank you.
And I did want to particularly reflect on today's election results. I mean, we have just re-elected David Cameron's Conservatives to run the country for a second term. Clearly, this is a vote for the insulated over the inclusive, or for the individual over the collective. This worldview seems to echo this critique of contemporary technology, or your critique, Evgeny, of contemporary technology. Do we get, I mean, this is particularly to the UK context, but I'm sure you'll have a wider answer. Do we get the technology we deserve?
Again, I have a very hard time debating technology in the abstract, right? I mean, technology ultimately is just a consequence of the infrastructures and decisions that we have set in place with regards to political, economic, perhaps cultural policies. So the reason why we end up using search and paying for it with our data is because at some point somebody decided not to put enough money into research and innovation in libraries. I mean, for me, it's quite obvious. The reason why it's provided by the private sector in the way it is provided and not provided by somebody else. Because if you look at the history of these technologies, if you look at the 60s and 70s, it was library and information science that was actually at the cutting edge of all the developments and the classification and indexing of information. It wasn't necessarily computer science. It was actually people sitting in libraries and thinking about how we're going to manage all this knowledge, right? And the reason why we ended up with the technological configuration that we have now, for me, is a function of political and economic choices and there are no choices made in the abstract. Of course, there are various imperatives, necessities, and so forth. So the reason why our technological landscape looks so much neoliberal is because our political landscape looks so much neoliberal. So you would not expect it to look any other way, I'm afraid. Of course, you do have exceptions, or people would point to Wikipedia, they would point to free software, they would point to other forms which are not yet as clear-cut on the sort of neoliberal spectrum as Facebook and Google are. But those are exceptions, right? And even they are riding on some of the infrastructures that was put in place by the neoliberal regime, if you will, and they're being exploited by that regime itself, right? So to me, it's actually it's not that we deserve it, it's just that the political exigencies are such that it's very hard for an alternative conception of technology to take place in this particular political climate. It doesn't mean that in a different political climate, a different conception of technology wouldn't emerge. It's just that you cannot expect miracles without doing some hard work.
Absolutely. I think that's the case for all of us. I wonder, James, should I go straight to another question, or do you have something to come back to there?
I could. I think, rather than dwelling on the particular who won part of the politics, I mean, the main thing to me seems, or one of the many main things, seems to be the structural disconnect between the actual the political landscape and the realities of social change that it's encountering. So the fact that you now have basically what Paul Mason really well described as these three tribes, essentially, the kind of nationalist Scots, the post-industrial North, and this asset-rich South, which a two-party system really has no way of doing and has been kind of locked out of. The individualism of that response, the lack of it seems to be, the failure of those things to disconnect seems to stem from a deep lack of literacy in these systems that are kind of coming about, post-industrial systems, and the kind of post-two-party system. There's a lack of literacy in that wider thing that leads to this alienation that reflects the same kind of alienation that results in, that comes from kind of contemporary use of social media and so on and so forth. The fact that if you end up in these filter bubbles online, these ideas of a utopia of electronic connection that we're all going to talk through and get a better political system have actually seemed to be increasingly separated us further. And that's because, as Evgeny regularly notes, they arise from this particular political view. We're going to end up with alienated social media users because the social media is built on alienating forms of capitalism. There are, however, I think, like things to draw from that. I was struck by when you said about the bad lessons, essentially, the wrong lessons that we're learning from the Snowden events, which for me are also, as well, part and parcel because the response seems to be like wider transparency or better laws or better encryption at the user level, all of which operate within the same dualistic system of invisibility versus visibility, spying versus transparency, these kind of dualistic systems which aren't really getting us anywhere, which is, again, the wider lesson that I learned from looking at technologies, the internet itself. I don't think they're the answer, but I think they provide us with forms of answers. Because the lesson that I learned from the internet is not, in fact, that better data, more control gets us anywhere. The lesson that I learned from the internet is what I've learned by exploring through it and the opportunities it's been given over the last, personally at an individual level over the last 20 years, to understand the world as a complex and messy place, both at a technological level and a social level. Those are not the lessons that we're being taught to learn from it by a political or sort of corporate class. We're being told it makes everything easier and simpler to deal with. I don't believe that is, and I think the fact that we're not learning that lesson is the same lack of literacy in systems that's causing the same political problems.
Thank you. In the Ways to be Secret display, it feels very pertinent to this discussion. We have exhibited a set of computers that belong to The Guardian, and they were destroyed by GCHQ, our intelligence services here, on the basis that they held data leaked by Edward Snowden. Alan Rushbridger has noted that this was an entirely symbolic act because, of course, this data existed in many different forms. this display has taken us as a museum and into some of these discussions that we are having tonight. And as you say, James, it can sometimes be a slightly dark or difficult place. And one of the things that I would ask you both to come back to me about is this idea of how we get beyond, if we want to change the debate, move the debate forward, how we might get beyond this stance of being the naysayer, or often being cast as the naysayer, or as somebody opposed to technology as opposed to progress. How can we get around this? And what are our means? Not necessarily of defeating Silicon Valley, but that would be nice. But kind of changing a debate, engendering a different form of engagement, rejecting this apathy.
Well, I always come to these questions, and I'm coming to it, I feel very hard right now in my own work, by doing projects like this and kind of play testing the approaches and seeing what the kind of outcomes are. And the reason partly in what I said just now in terms of this, hitting this kind of roadblock in terms of transparency and understanding is because it's been my practice for quite a long time to, the usual term is kind of making the invisible visible, looking for these metaphors or representations of complex systems with the intention of kind of educating people about them, to kind of make them understand better. And that seems to me also to be completely analogous with the process of WikiLeaks and Snowden revelations, that aspect that by revealing more information about these things, we somehow change them. That there's some kind of, it's this thing about that the NSA and the WikiLeaks essentially have the same view on the world, that there is some kind of deep, dark secret at the heart of the world, that if we can only bring it to light, it will sort of make it magically better, which I think is also what the kind of, teaching theory of museums and a huge amount of other things are actually based on, that there's this kind of structure that will reveal and make it better. And I feel that personally, coming through my own work into that's not really functioning anymore. That it's embedding us into those same kind of head-to-head fights. But if we can use these examples, use the examples of spying to illuminate slightly deeper societal structural things that actually allow us to move out of that oppositional mode. Essentially, to move back, I'm just going to hand over to Evgeny to say this is about capitalism now. But essentially, there is an organizational principle at the heart of this which will actually raise us out of those that kind of dualistic position for me.
I used to say, and still do that, Silicon Valley is what we can call the Teflon industry, in that no matter how much dirt you throw at it, nothing is going to stick. And nobody is going to view it with the same degree of criticality or attention or skepticism that we would view other industries, be it banks or oil companies. And not that those industries are being severely regulated or taxed or whatever, but still, at least in the popular imagination, there is some conception of this.
Which gives you a good idea of where Silicon Valley is at the other end.
Sure. But there is not even, I think, basic idea that there might be something about these companies that's not necessarily in the interests of us, the citizens, right? And then how they work. And I think what they have managed to convince us quite successfully over the last 2 decades, or a decade, is that they are the only possible way to run each of their specific services. They have convinced us that there is no other way to organize search other than Google. There is no other way to organize social networking other than Facebook. And it's not just on a company-by-company basis. I'm not saying that Bing is better than Google. I'm saying that they have convinced us that the right way to do it is by delegating it to a particular market player and to leave it there. And if you do start from a very banal assumption that the main core tenet of neoliberalism is that there is no alternative. Well, Silicon Valley is at the very front. There is really no alternative to Silicon Valley, the way it conceives of the world. And I think the only way, in which we can still try to recover from its hegemony, if you will, is by trying to imagine these alternative structures, which will not just be a matter of technological architecture, but because, as I've tried to explain in my short intervention, it's not just a matter of us not being able to build and conceive of the right technology, just that the transformations that are happening in other domains of social life with the state controlled by the banks and other players at its center do not favor an alternative conception of technology. So we will not be able to resolve any of these technological issues without presenting them as political and economic ones, and then actually trying to figure out what it is we can do to defeat the project. So the worst that can happen is not that, we will be portrayed as enemies of technology. And this is, by the way, the trick that Silicon Valley always plays. Because every time, and this also has to do with the way in which they completely have monopolized and hegemonized the conversation, every time you start raising questions about Google and Facebook, you're being immediately portrayed as a hater of technological progress. You're being portrayed as somebody who just wants to unplug, go live in the woods, and perhaps not to have any modern water supply and just have a well somewhere from which you take water. I mean, to me, this just sounds so bizarre. It's as if anybody who would dare to criticize big pharmaceutical companies would be accused of opposing modern medicine. I mean, it's completely insane the way this debate has been running, but it has been running like that precisely because the economic, political foundations of modern technologies have been completely hidden from view. So they are presented as, the feats of modern engineering and not as the cutting edge of the neoliberal project. And that, to me, is the problem, that we need to unlearn this vocabulary. We need to unlearn the language of Silicon Valley. And this language is now permeating all the institutions, from European Commission to charities to foundations to UN, you name it. Everybody wants to organize a hackathon. I mean, show me an institution that doesn't want to organize a hackathon. Like, everybody wants to do a hackathon.
I'm sure we've done many of them here. James.
Yeah, and as someone who's refused to take part in hackathons on many occasions because I object to free labor for corporations. I entirely agree with that. But there's an interesting thing here, which is that I'm not actually that interested in defeating Silicon Valley. I'm interested in defeating the powers that generate things like Silicon Valley. Like, the Silicon Valley is just an emanation, as you said, of those deeper things. So the ultimate target isn't Silicon Valley itself either. And there's still a bit of me that does refuse to kind of dismiss the potential of those technologies outside Silicon Valley, and not to kind of lump them all in as the same thing. I think this is quite key as well, because again, it comes back to my experience of the internet, my experience of learning to code, which I credit, frankly, with kind of educating me about complex systems, which gave me a political base. Those are useful things. The history of technology has, and particularly of the internet, has much to teach us in terms of generating decentralized systems. I don't believe that those are not lessons that we can't kind of bring back and apply. This is for me is the kind of crazy paradox of contemporary technologies, is that they absolutely and totally reify underlying political assumptions, biases, trends, prejudices, and privileges, the whole load. They're all just built into the machines that we use. And yet at the same time, they render those biases and privileges and everything else more visible to us than has ever been before, because they have to be written down and enacted as code. They're a lot less subtle than they used to be. They've always been oppressive political structures. They've also often been really much harder to quantify, to establish, to draw a picture of, to point at, and to kind of illustrate. That alone gives us some kind of power. And if the internet for me is nothing else, it's kind of the best tool we've built as a species yet for mapping the world out as something that we can understand. So there must be something kind of salvageable and usable within that points possibly to some kind of underlying change, because if these technologies are just that, they're not merely products of the underlying politics either. They still, for me at least, remain the potential of being tools for changing it and understanding it as well.
Okay, thank you. I would like to think that there is some optimism to be had there too. I was going to, on that note, open it up to the audience. Gentleman with the grey hair. Please just wait for the microphone.
Hello there. I'm particularly interested in education. That's where I work, and globally. And I was very taken, Evgeny, by what you were saying about internet.org and the effectively investing in technology for the value of people in later life. One of the debates that I'm constantly facing in a variety of educational summits around the world is this thing called affordable learning. And I mean, indeed, internet.org is part of this as well, which is the idea that we are doing a good thing, as if we were missionaries, by providing affordable learning through these digital infrastructures, you know, whether it's MOOCs or some other form, and all the biases that go with that. I wonder whether you could expand on this idea of solving the world's education problems by freezing it in software.
Sure, well, I don't actually think it's just a matter of freezing it in software. I think the pitch that's being made by these companies, I can understand why it appeals to many governments who strike deals with those companies. I mean, first of all, many of the governments that strike those deals happen already to be center-right, neoliberal, however you want to describe them, even though you have occasional exceptions. Like recently in Brazil, you actually had an agreement, some kind of an agreement between the government and Facebook also with regards to internet.org, but predominantly they're already leaning towards some kind of market-based solution to problems, whether it's education, health, or something else. But on top of that, the offer that's made by Silicon Valley is irresistible for two reasons, and it's that it's not just affordable, it's free. Right? They're actually coming and saying we're going to subsidize, we'll subsidize the infrastructural costs, we'll subsidize the data costs as long as it puts people back to our product, which is Facebook, right? And second, we'll let you, the government, enjoy the tremendous publicity benefits that accrue to you as you're being seen as doing some cutting-edge work with technology. Right? Because all of those things are seen as software technology innovation. They're not being seen as an extension of a particular agenda that seeks to privatize education. Right? So I can see why the governments would be up for it and would actually be inviting Facebook to come into their schools and thus shift more and more content, a word that I hate but have to use, to Facebook. So, you look at the agreement that Facebook struck, I think it was the government of Zambia when they first launched internet.org. The agreement there was that the government of Zambia will strike a deal between Facebook, Harvard, and I think MIT, because they have this joint MOOC initiative, right? And they would make those courses available to students in Zambian schools, but only if those courses are routed through Facebook. So essentially, you can now study the courses from Facebook and MIT, from Harvard at MIT. You wouldn't have to pay for the data on your phone to access them. But what are the implications? The implications is that the only way to access them would be for you to have a Facebook account, to join it, and to basically reroute the entire learning process through a corporate layer, so that Facebook would actually be present at every single step of the learning process, right? Which was not at all the case before, right? When we dealt with other kinds of corporatization, with textbooks, whatever, school lunches, whatever. It's not the first time it happens. It's just that now the scale is massive, right? So in that sense, I think on a very banal and vulgar level, I think the way to try to defeat it, again, is to try to present Silicon Valley as an industry that has a certain monetary interest and other interests. And, what I usually say is that, Facebook is interested in digital inclusion to the same extent that loan sharks are interested in financial inclusion, right? There is money to be made for both. So when we talk about affordable learning, affordable should not be the only criteria and should perhaps be seen for what it is, which might be affordable, but aren't we paying taxes for education anyway? Why do we have to worry about affordability all of a sudden, right? And this is where you can actually introduce some political dimension to the discussion to at least save it from being completely dominated by solutions which are completely free. Because it's very hard to argue against schemes which actually require no public spending. It's very hard. So you really have to point out what are their flaws, right? And this is where you have to battle between zero cost and some kind of broader political, social, cultural set of concerns. And who gives a damn about those these days, right? Since our language itself has been so corrupted by economic considerations, the cost argument wins, right? And this is why I think the problem is much deeper than just us talking about software and code and things like that.
I would agree. But it's that challenge, of course, isn't it? How to bring this discussion away from technology and back to the political, the infrastructural. I mean, it's one of the things that we here as a department in the museum, in a modest scale, but still are trying to do, is to bring this discussion about civic life, the just and fair society, back to these questions of design. Of course, we work across architecture and urbanism, product design, but also the digital. And yes, there is the digital, which is the kind of the near future, the glitzy, the lovely, but also it's one of the very reasons that we've asked James to come and work with us is these software programs. They are part of our designed world, and we very much need to understand them. And as a museum, we question this idea of whether as a civic institution, there is a role for us. And I wonder, James, if you might, if this is okay, expand a little bit on whether doing this project in a museum has, I mean, of course, the interest in the collections of the museum, but more of the museum as a civic space, how that has impacted on the work that you've done, or if it has at all.
I mean, the main pressure, I think, of doing that kind of work in a museum rather than other kinds of particularly contemporary art space is that it does come with those certain sets of civic values, that this is a space that is open to the public, that is free to enter, and where that work is done, you know, by and large for a public benefit. Now, there's a lot of kind of corporate financial pressures on institutions. Britain's lucky to have had things like free access to museums for a while now, some museums, which is insanely lucky and compared to huge amounts of the world, and is also currently under incredible amounts of stress. But so there's a different kind of voice and tone I think it's possible to adopt when working in these spaces, which I've tried to, that you know you're talking to a different form of public, that you can talk to that public in a different way. And that comes, I think, with a desire to, education is a difficult word, but we're in the V&A, so I guess you can assume some form of privilege here. You're trying to, talk to people and get a kind of message across. So I think, for me, I could afford to be more kind of free and outspoken in many ways. Yes, that's what I have to say about that.
Okay, another question?
Do you think the conversation is slightly shifting away? So it sounds like there's been no criticism, but with Internet.org launching in India, loads of partners pulled out with that under pressure from activists this week. We got the digital single market from the European Union, which is going to look precisely at data, how the sharing economy in particular is using it. Do you think the conversation is slightly shifting? And if it is, do you think it's going to make any difference?
Should I answer? Should we take more?
Answer, and then we'll take it.
Well, I mean, it's shifting. I'm not sure whether it's shifting in a direction that I would like, particularly when you think about what's happening in Europe when it comes to regulating the Googles and Facebooks of the world. But first, on Internet.org, I mean, it's true that in India, there has been a campaign led by a lot of civil society activists tied very much to the net neutrality kind of debate, and it has managed to at least raise this issue to a level where people are aware of the stakes. It hasn't happened in most countries, and even in the week that you had this active campaign in India, you had this meeting between Dilma Rousseff and Mark Zuckerberg completely out of the blue with the president of Brazil wearing a Facebook hoodie in a picture that received quite a lot of attention online, and she would be the last person we would normally expect to be wearing that hoodie, to be honest, especially given all of her concerns about surveillance, NSA, and being very angry at NSA. She then ends up, standing next to Mark Zuckerberg, right? So, I mean, even there you can see how completely twisted the post-Snowden debate still is. But with regards to the European stuff, I think the situation there is actually very depressing because, yes, it's true. If you look at the surface, you have a lot of protest against Google and Facebook, how bad they are. If you look at it closely, it's a discussion that's pushed by a bunch of competitors that these companies have in Europe and by other industries that are about, they think so, get disrupted by Google and Facebook. So it's German car companies, banks, and so forth, who are getting extremely worried about where this data and the sensors will go next. And it's clear where they would go next. They will go to turn your car into a platform. And you know that the moment your car becomes a platform, these companies have very little to offer because it will be dominated by a very different kind of model at which companies like Apple, Facebook, and Google excel, and companies like Ford, Mercedes, and others, you can just pick the European ones, do not. The talk of European digital single market, I mean, it sounds good on paper because, yes, ultimately it would be great not to pay finally those roaming charges. A dream project that, has been in the workings for 2 decades and will probably that proverbial fridge that runs out of milk and buys milk, from a supermarket will arrive before you'll get rid of the roaming charges in Europe. But other than that, if you look at everything else that the Commission has been doing, it's very depressing stuff. When they're doing copyright, I would argue favors one set of players, and those are publishers, and many of them are German publishers. It doesn't favor the interests of ordinary citizens and ordinary Europeans. So, debate is changing in that we can now talk critically about Silicon Valley, but the objective here is not to talk critically about Silicon Valley. The objective here is to show the technological for what it is, which is political and economic. And, once you do that, I'm not sure that the solution to Google and Facebook is to give more power to Mercedes or Deutsche Bank or whatever company you want to pick, right? So in that sense, we're not actually doing the kind of project I've been gesturing sort of towards. It's not us trying to read Google, Facebook, and others as playing some kind of political and economic roles in contemporary capitalism. It's us just, in Europe being very anxious about them breaking antitrust law or whatever. But, even antitrust law for me, assumes that the primary dimension in which these issues ought to be discussed is the economic one. And I'm not sure that I accept that premise. And the problem is that the European Commission at this point has no other ways of talking because they primarily raison d'etre is the economic one. They will not talk about social justice, they will not talk about equality because they don't know how to talk that language anymore. They'll talk about whatever stuff you can measure, competitiveness, and so forth. So I'm very concerned actually by where the debate is going. It's not going in a direction that I would consider healthy by any means.
I'd raise an example of that same interplay between this sort of startling lack of choice, but also where it kind of bumps up against the state quite heavily, is one that's going on, I think, in the UK at the moment. I know in the UK at the moment, it's going to actually be quite an important issue for a small interest segment for the first months of this government, which is that for the last 5 years, I'm sure most people are aware of, the government's been doing a huge push towards better web services, the gov.uk domain, these kind of internet services, which are by and large a lot better to use than it used to be to interact with government. They've got a really hard problem coming up, which is when they start getting into the really gnarly problems of how governments interact with their systems, like collecting taxes, these kind of things, and then you try and correlate them across different systems, right? And then you've got to sort of plug things into the benefit system, and you've got to connect it to the health system, and all this thing is now being done, and it's trying to be done better than government, and one of the requirements for that is some kind of single identification system, right? This is what naturally flows from that kind of integration. And everyone's like, yes, we want better web services. And the government's like, okay, well, we'll build a big database of all your identities so that you can log into this brilliant system we're building. And they're like, oh, no, well, we don't want that, do we? Obviously. So there's this kind of huge paradox at the heart of that. And the proposals that are currently floating around, that basically we have third-party providers. And those third-party providers are basically either going to be Facebook and Google or Serco, or some even more horrible combination of all of the above, right? Like this is where those things go. But but that comes at the same time as a complete failure of trust in the governments. Like we don't want to give the government a central identity base, and they know that identity cards are a completely unwinnable war. So that we're also foisting them upon them at the same time, this choice that where our agency actually lies within that to, like, do we just reject all, like, forms of identifying ourselves to government, go just James C. Scott and, like, there's no other way out? I'm genuinely unsure about that, but it's another example of these kind of really tight levels of lack of choice we have within those systems.
Thank you. I realise we have another question here.
I'm really interested in the idea that sort of this really simple idea that advertising is driving these mega companies. Just the simple old idea of ads is what Google and Facebook are trying to get. And as an example of that, strangely enough, I had a conversation with someone at Google Maps yesterday about trying to help get Google Maps to be more responsive to people. Say, like, I've just arrived in London this morning, you want to have a map that shows you a hierarchy of places and see the city in different ways. But the Google response was, well, we already know what you want to see when you go to London because we know what you do. We know what you've been doing for 10 years, so we're going to offer that straight up to you. So basically, they've got my data set, which they say, okay, this person who happens to live in Brooklyn, you know, he's going to want to go to this and this and this and see that and then that. And they're going to offer me that, which to me is a sort of dramatic narrowing of my world. And that, I'm sure that's coming up every time I do a search. They're telling me what I should be searching at, bracketing me into this thing, which is sort of frightening. So I guess the question is, how do we bust up our algorithms? Is there a way to kind of get out of that pigeonholing and narrowing of my life because they've got all of my data? And is it regulation, or do I have to personally kind of become an activist and undo my data set?
I mean, the first thing is don't use Google products. I would really emphasize genuinely not impossible. But equally, if not disengage with them entirely, and without necessarily becoming the full-on activist, gain an understanding of how they work so that we can actually have that engagement with them at a level. I don't think that just top-down legislation is the right answer, and I don't think complete kind of abolishment is necessarily the right answer as well. But you do touch on the fact that most of what it's doing is largely invisible to the average user, and so it does shape stuff. The thing, though, is that when what you're touching on is also the general slide towards that of kind of prediction and the way in which kind of data is treated. And actually what the example that I'm working with in the citizenship project that was mentioned earlier is actually that what those assumptions about what data can tell you do in other contexts beyond advertising, essentially. The project that I'm working on is a project about algorithmic citizenship. And the notion of algorithmic citizenship is derived from the way in which the intelligence services work. In particular, because they're not allowed to surveil citizens of their own country under law, they have to constantly, within the data they're accumulating, determine those people's citizenship in order to do it, in order to work out whether they can surveil them or whether they hand them over to the other partner who'll surveil them and then give them the data back. The way they do that is precisely the same way you are tracked online, by analyzing your behavior patterns, by looking at these kind of things. And so, moment by moment, in the way that a database thinks where you might go to visit in London or what adverts you might like to see, it's also making judgments about your citizenship status. And out of that come, as we know from Hannah Arendt, like citizenship is the right to have rights. It's kind of from what all of this stuff flows. The need to have a full and deep understanding of how those systems work, and potentially the opportunity to refuse them, does come down absolutely very directly to your kind of every time we interact with the state and citizenship, and kind of all of our rights do flow from that. So I totally contradict myself by saying that is not an important concern.
So I would say there are at least four answers I can think of to the problem you've identified. First answer would be, let's say, the neoliberal one. And the neoliberal answer would tell you, well, you have a problem with the tools which are free, invest some money, get yourself better tools. Invest into a course, learn how to code, build your own tools, apps, be happy, right? And you can clearly see how it would work even for things like privacy. We don't like NSA spying and you pay $3,000 a pound to get yourself a fully encrypted phone, you'll be okay, right? The same logic can apply to apps that are insecure or, unpredictable. There will be, if there isn't already, some kind of luxurious premium and alternative to most of the free products we're using, right? You can pay, be happy, solve the problem individually through the market. Solution number two would be artistic, right? And it's some kind of a system that will enable you to beat the system with some kind of random behavior, right? A good example here would be this extension to your email or your browser, which will append a paragraph of NSA keywords at the end of every email to jam NSA's filtering system, so that every time you're exchanging an email, there will be something mentioning bin Laden and Al-Qaeda appended at the end of it. I mean, that's not how you necessarily stay away from NSA's attention, but if enough people do it, that will probably clog their system. And you can think of all the other artistic solutions, like, wearing all sorts of weird masks to detect facial recognition and so forth. Solution number three would be some kind of legalistic political approach. And it would be to say, well, we can apply a principle like net neutrality also to platforms, and we'll come up with something like platform neutrality. So we'll have to make sure that Google doesn't favor its own products when it shows you the results. We'll have to make sure that it behaves as a common carrier, right? And you'll take that principle that has been kind of applied, but maybe we can, in net neutrality, you apply it to the platform, right? Again, political, legalistic approach. I wouldn't necessarily favor any of those three. The fourth solution, and the fourth approach would be, for the lack of a better word, you can call it political radical, somewhat, whatever. However radical it is, we might disagree, but this approach would start from a somewhat different end, and it would ask, what if you have an idea of how you can actually build a better Google Maps, right? How long would it take you to bring it to fruition? Well, the normal answer would be, well, you start some bullshit startup, go raise venture capital, and maybe you succeed, right? That's the answer today, and 99% of the people fail. But if you approach this from a different angle and you think about it, what are the things that prevent you from trying to build a better Google Maps, at least for your own use or for your neighborhood's use or for your city's use? It's the fact that you do not have the access to the underlying infrastructure that generates the data, and you don't have the data itself. So the reason why Google has managed to do all of that is because they invested a lot of money to go and photograph every single building. They've managed to operate a system of networks built in our phones, which can actually predict traffic in real time. They've done all of that. They have all that infrastructure. So anybody who wants to compete with them and offer a better map service would actually need to rebuild that infrastructure. But on the other hand, if you really want to think radical, if you can have a system whereby this infrastructure, and I'm talking both about the technological end and the virtual data end, right, actually does not belong to any single player and can actually be shared commonly by citizens, states, nations. We can think very big here. Given that nations also want to spy on this data anyway, they'll be more than happy to run it. But that question aside, if you can think of an alternative way in which that data can be, and infrastructure can be owned and operated, it would be very easy for any civic initiative, NGO, but also smart startups to come and innovate and search and in all the other domains in a way that is impossible now, because one or two companies have hoovered up all the data and have hoovered up all the infrastructure and are sitting on them, right? They do not even believe in their own neoliberal dogma that they're preaching. They are not fostering innovation by, letting decentralized marketplace to come in and build solutions on top of that data. No, just one company or two companies that are basically innovating on their own and not letting anybody in, right? And again, I'm not necessarily pushing for complete replacement of the market with some kind of central land agency. This is not what it's about. But we have to be clear about what are the things that have to be led out of the market realm. And in this case, I would argue that something like data or the infrastructure that generates it would make for a very good target. And once you do that, you can have whatever market relations you want. You can have entrepreneurs, startups come and build those apps, whatever else you want to call it, right? But you have to make some priorities, and if you don't, then you're going to end up with one or two companies hoovering up all the data and running the entire show. And this is why, by the way, I'll finish here. This is why I think that the current efforts in the European Commission to address the Google question through antitrust misleading, because they do not understand that if you actually want to build an effective search engine, you need data from very different domains. You do want to know where you are when you're making a search to show you effective search results, right? So you need to operate also the sensor in your phone. I mean, this is, to me, is clear, right? Which makes the case that you do need to think of ways of aggregating that data. And clearly, the only alternative on the table right now is to let Google aggregate all of it and then run all of everything, or you kind of put it in a different market and legal relationship, and then, you know, a very different world emerges bottom up. Sorry, it was a very long answer.
James.
There is also a fifth option, but I'm going to keep it to myself.
Maybe James could give the fifth option.
No, it's not the fifth option. I just wanted to point out places in which that is absolutely kind of occurring and kind of happening now, and it's not being, you know, completely a crazy pipe dream. The main example being OpenStreetMap, which is a, you know, completely free, completely open, and user created, with all the problems that brings, kind of map of the world. And also to point out where that has just also been insanely powerful and useful, which is its use in disaster management, which is and it's the most recent deployment of the humanitarian OpenStreetMaps team in response to the Nepal disaster has been extraordinary. And it's been in part due to the readiness of certain systems they've been building over time, that they can rapidly deploy highly accurate, but also crucially in a disaster zone, editable maps of a location. When you actually need to update, you know, this road is no longer here. And you can do that because you're using kind of open technologies. With also the assistance from both large state organizations that have committed to releasing stuff for free, like NASA and satellite imagery, and also private companies that have also supplied huge amounts of usually very expensive satellite imagery stuff kind of for free. Those things have all come together kind of at these moments of crises when everyone goes, okay, this is the moment at which we can help. But should also, frankly, be used as a stick to beat the institutions which say that that is a completely unworkable proposition, because we've built a huge number of kind of tools in the tool chain that show that these other forms of structuring the technology are entirely possible. And so that it should be, you know, incredibly obvious that the one stumbling block is those kind of, you know, copyright, corporate and other forms of control.
Thank you. I'm aware that we're coming to the end of our event. I wondered if there was one last question, or... Yeah, Mariana in the back.
Thank you both for the presentations. I really liked the comment that James made in the beginning about the difficulty of speaking or commenting or critiquing surveillance without doing surveillance. And so I also enjoy the development of the conversation into the notion of infrastructure and how do we move away from technology in a sense and perhaps start discussing the social sphere, or let's stick with the infrastructure. And as an architect, I think that infrastructure is something that can and has been historically reinvented many times, of course. And so in that sense, if the target to critique or to comment on is infrastructure, do we need an infrastructural art, and what could that be?
It's a large one.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, because the question is, like, in what domain do you apply these kind of forms of criticism, essentially, and is the question, can it be done through art, like, to some extent? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just as, I have to say this, but I think it's just as valid a form of, you know, of involvement and criticism as any other ones. Not least because, you know, I try to write critically and do journalism and that kind of form of stuff around this in other ways. And for me, the benefit of putting it out into these other forms that are not necessarily quite so didactic all the time, even though I kind of struggle not to make them that myself most of the time, is that you do get to present these kind of other forms and ways of seeing the thing. And the main thing that I think I get to do through making works like this is that phrase I used earlier, which is kind of generate better metaphors, or at least kind of different metaphors for this stuff. To provide those kind of other ways of thinking, potentially radical ones, that it's incredibly hard to do in a very narrow political discourse, because it's assumed that discourse is kind of so fixed, and it's so circumcised, and there's such loud voices in it, that I think other forms of kind of presentation can do a lot to make people aware of the kind of other possibilities embedded in that. I also think it's, just for the record, it's also possible to do that through making bits of technology and doing all this. All these systems are still embedded within other systems. If you make art, you still may be subject to gallery pressures, commercial pressures, institutional pressures, all this. Just as by making programs, software, you're subjected to other platforms, software languages, the politics embedded in all of these things. But each of them, and I don't really believe art is a magically special case, but I think it has a magically special historical place, and that carries through to a large extent and is useful. All of them present opportunities for critique and interesting things in their own way. What I would say is, though, that with regard to the doing more surveillance art thing, and particularly when it comes to making art that involves or speaks about technology as a way of speaking about political change as well, like, it does require the same kind of discipline and literacy in the subject that other forms of art require. There's a lot of bad tech art in general, just as there's a lot of bad surveillance art in general, and God knows I've made some of it, but it usually comes of not having as firm a necessary grasp of the material as possible, and that's where we kind of come back to the literacy thing. I don't think learning to code solves everything. I mean, I know it doesn't, but I think it's also a necessary tool, particularly for artists involved in this domain.
Thank you, James. I wondered, is that it, or no pressure? Fantastic. Thank you all very, very much for attending this evening. We are in a museum, and it has been mentioned a few times that it's a place of education, and I hope you might leave inspired and in some senses either tooled up or thinking of tools of how we might think about readdressing our digital public realm and our roles within it. Thank you. And just on that last note, while I remember, we have another event on the 22nd of May, which is next Friday, and it's about, the title is, Does This Bridge Belong to All of Us? And it's about the Garden Bridge debate here in London and physical architectural public space that is green. Please do come. It's been a thrill to have you here tonight, and thank you very much. And thank our speakers, of course.